Now, actually, an interesting way just to reflect on the different standards of justice and how they get translated both into your soul and then into society at large is to read and reflect on Book 8 of Plato's Republic. And since we're not reading it for this class, I'm going to give you a basic summary of it. First of all, it's important to remember that the whole point of the Republic is not to organize the best society. Right? The Republic is a book that is trying to understand what is the proper order of the human soul. The city that is envisioned in the Republic is supposed to be an analogy for the soul. You all know what an analogy is, right? The city is supposed to be like, in some ways like, and in some ways different than the human soul. The whole point of the Republic, as is explicitly said by Socrates in Book 2, is that we want to like blow up the soul, and we want to, we want to magnify the soul and make it big in the form of a city so we can see its different parts. The whole point of the Republic, another big point of the Republic, is that, and I think it's a point that is true, it's like a sociological fact. You can't avoid it. I'm not saying things should be this way. I'm saying things are this way. That in every society there are leaders. In every classroom there are leaders. And the leaders inhabit the institutions of the society. And the leaders, by inhabiting the institutions of a society, they shape those institutions. Their souls shape those institutions. And those institutions, in turn, shape the education, the laws, the culture, and the customs of the society. And if you want to know what a society is really like, study the souls of the leaders. Because the leaders impress their way of life on everybody else. Not by force, not by coercion, but by sheer leadership. Now, what are the leading institutions of a society? They are things like the military, the business leaders, the leaders that would, in our day and age, would be in Hollywood and the music industry, film, television, and theater. So politicians are leaders too. And then academia, teachers. So if you want to know what a society is like and what direction it's going, study the souls of the leaders, which we can do now in ways that we were never able to do before, because leaders write memoirs. And after they die, their memoirs are published, and they keep diaries. And after they die, we can read their diaries, and we can judge their souls. Because why? We can learn first of all, we can learn how they ordered their lives, and we can learn what their true intentions are, at least in as much as they are willing to commit them to paper. It's actually fascinating to study both biography, philosophy, and history at the same time. It gets you into a lot of trouble. It can get you in a lot of trouble. So that's what I like to do. But for what Plato describes in Book 8 of the Republic are the various ways in which souls are organized. And it's fascinating to read it, because you could almost say that Book 8 of the Republic is an outline of the history of Western civilization in the last 400 years. Why do I say that? Pretty much from books 2 until the Republic is 10 books. From books 2 to books 8, so 2 through 7, let's say. He lays out the criteria of justice, what virtue is, what would be the order of justice, or what would be the order of virtue in a just soul. And the basic order of a soul that's living justice, it's just as Aquinas says, right? There's God. So the just soul, the soul would be subordinate to God. And the soul would subordinate to itself the body and soul together. And the body and soul together would subordinate the body. And the body would subordinate to itself exterior goods. There's a proper order or hierarchy to things. In the well-ordered soul, basically it's virtue. Virtue is the power of the soul to order everything to its proper end. In a well-ordered soul, the soul will have the habit or disposition to use everything or to do everything that it does in a way that is ordered to its proper end. This, my friends, is Plato. It's not. We're not talking. I mean, Aquinas is building on Plato and Aristotle when he writes the questions we've gone through today. All right, this is not. This is just basic philosophy of the ancient world before Christ. Obviously, when Aquinas or Augustine see this, they're going to build on it. There's a way in which it resonates or conforms with what faith teaches us. If you read the Old Testament, for example, it's pretty clear. Every time Israel deviates from the covenant, it's because she pursues wealth or power or pleasure in a disordered way. Right? She fornicates. She uses wealth to grind her neighbors, or she becomes too concerned about military power. Those are the primary ways that Israel deviates from the covenant in the Old Testament. So someone who's familiar with the Old Testament is going to look at Plato and say, gosh, it's pretty similar. So the virtuous soul is the soul that uses justice as the standard by which she judges good and evil actions. Since Greg was saying we're going medieval here, when I refer to the soul, I'm always going to call it she now. Because the medievals would call the soul she. Because it's the highest part of the human. They would. That was... Okay. Question? Oh, okay. So in Book 8, what does Plato say? He says, well, how could a soul go from being virtuous to becoming corrupt, to becoming tyrannical? And he says, well, it's very simple if you think about it. And actually, I think even in the United States, you could look at the progress of generations from, well, there's kind of an ebb and flow because things start to go really bad in the 20s, and then the Depression and the Second World War. As Aristotle says, calamities and wars always return people. It's easy to see how calamities and wars can return people to a basic notion of justice and temperance. It's hard to do that in a time of leisure. It's easy to do it in a time of war. And so you could say that by the 20s, our culture was almost lost as far as morality goes. Because in the 20s we had euthanasia, we had infanticide, we were killing old people, we were neutering retarded people, we were doing all that kind of stuff in the 20s. And there's this one guy, he's kind of infamous, well, he actually was celebrated in the 50s, named Paul Blanchard. He wrote a book in the 50s saying that the worst thing that happened to the eugenics movement and the euthanasia movement and the movement of sexual liberation in the 20s was the Depression and the Second World War. He said it moved us back 50 years. Right? So now, in the 90s and in the 2000s, we have the return of all these things. 50 years later. So, but Plato says, look, here's what happens. It's easy to explain. The soul that is virtuous, the standard of the soul that is virtuous is justice. What happens, though, is that the man who lives justice will oftentimes be treated poorly by others. Right? The man who lives justice will oftentimes, he won't care about his reputation. And so his wife will secretly speak to the children, and she won't even realize she's doing this, but she'll, through her comments and things like that, the children will start to feel that they need to at least get the reputation or the honor that their father had. So the children will not be willing to be unvirtuous, and the children won't be philosophers. They won't understand why necessarily they're living virtue, but they will live virtuous lives. When I think of that, I think of my grandparents. My grandparents, pretty much tried to live virtuous lives, stayed together, stayed married. This is right after the Second World War, let's say, right? Get married, stay together. We have laws in our house. We do things that are honorable. We don't make a lot of money. But we're not able oftentimes to in a sophisticated way or philosophically defend our way of life to the young whippersnappers of the 60s. Right? So what Plato says is that this soul that lives by honor or reputation or glory starts to lose virtue. They don't really live by... The standard is no longer justice, but it's honor or reputation. An athlete or men in the army or women in the army oftentimes live what Plato calls the Timocratic way of life. Timocracy, or the Timocratic soul, is the soul in which honor or glory becomes the standard by which that soul judges its behavior. And a Timocratic society is where honor is the standard by which actions are judged. So the military can be like this. Sports, before it becomes oligarchic, is like this. The NH, it's actually, I went to the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto last spring break. It's very fascinating because hockey began as a competition kind of for honor between a bunch of cities in North America and in Canada and in the north of the United States. And in the 19-teens and 1920s, a bunch of oligarchs got control of hockey. And in the 1920s in hockey, there was the salaries of the players went way up. People were buying and selling teams. They were buying and selling players. The number of teams in the NHL went up to like 20 or something like that. In other words, hockey went from being based on honor to, in the 1920s, being based on money. And most sports did, actually. And then the Depression and the war reduced hockey back down to 8 teams. And then the 8 teams remained that way until the 70s. And then hockey became oligarchical again, ruled by money and competition. And now if you imagine a family, Plato says, that's dominated by honor or reputation, the mother and the sons will realize that the father, oftentimes, in order to defend his honor, will not make money. He won't do unscrupulous. In other words, he's still kind of governed by virtue. It's not that he abandons virtue completely, but he would rather lose money than lose his honor. So the Timocratic family is often poor, or they're not as wealthy as everybody else. I have known countless students. I see my own family this way sometimes, where the dad is an honorable man. Like I know this one guy, his dad works on the railroad going from New York City out to New Jersey somewhere. And this guy always says about him, he says, "My dad's an honorable man, but he doesn't make a lot of money, and my goal in life is to make a lot of money." So what happens is almost through the way the wife talks about the father and the way the son perceives the father, the son gives in to the money-making desire. And he becomes oligarchical. The oligarchical soul is the soul that judges good or bad based on money. And when the oligarchical soul emerges, right, the oligarchical son, basically he tries to buy with money the reputation that his father was never able to have. So he gives himself over to the desire for making money. Now, an oligarchical society, like our own, or maybe we're more democratic now than oligarchical, but an oligarchical society would be a society in which money becomes the standard of good and evil, or success and failure. Right? Money is used to judge whether someone is good or evil or successful or unsuccessful in life. And I would say that sometime in the early 20th century, we went from a timocratic to an oligarchical society. And different institutions. If you look at it by institution, you could say different institutions might have different standards. So you could say the military, well, it's always going to be more or less timocratic. But you could say certainly the business world very quickly goes from timocracy to oligarchy. The political world, who knows? It's probably very little timocracy, but a lot of oligarchy and a lot of democracy. Now, the children of the oligarch, they look at their parents who have given over to the desire for making money, and they almost unconsciously say to themselves, well, if you've given over to the desire for money, why can't I give in to another desire? Right? So Plato says the children of the oligarchs will start to experiment in lotus. They'll become lotus eaters. Lotus eaters was kind of narcotics in the ancient world. Or they will experiment in all sorts of pleasures that are forbidden. Sexual pleasures, licentiousness. They will start to give what he calls equal access to all the pleasures. And they will become democrats, at least when they're young. The democratic soul is the soul that treats all the desires or all the pleasures the same. In other words, our relativist, the relativist you will meet in the dorm tonight when you're talking about the lecture today, is really a democratic soul. Relativism is at home in democracy. Plato says that a democracy will become multicultured, in which all the pleasures are given equal access in society or in the soul. Right? So a democratic soul is a soul that tries to pursue in an unrestrained way all the pleasures. And a democratic society is a society that basically has a relativistic standard of judging morality. It treats everything the same, every desire the same, every pleasure the same. Now, democratic souls and democratic societies are very unstable. I mean, just think of a person who's a drunk all the time or addicted to something. This person is not, or Nietzsche, right? This person is not very trustworthy. So what happens is that usually the person who as a young man is democratic, as an old man becomes oligarchical, right? And for the sake of living order, the older man will say, well, I'll limit my pleasure and I'll limit my desire to one, to making money. And what we see in the United States, I think, over the last 40 or 50 years, is what Plato says will happen. There will be a combat that will take place between oligarchy and democracy in society. One generation will be oligarchic, another generation will be democratic. One group will be more given over to the money-making desire, which requires a kind of order in society. The other group will be given over more to equal access to all the pleasures. Right? So you got the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans want just enough order to make money. The Democrats want unrestrained access to all the pleasures. They want a multicolored way of life. There's an author who wrote a book a couple years ago called Bobo's in Paradise, in which he says that the ironic thing that happened to the U.S. in the 90s is that another way of looking at the oligarch would be called the bourgeois. And the Democrats would be the bohemians. This guy, David Brooks, who wrote Bobo's in Paradise, he says, for about 200, ever since the French Revolution in the West, the basic conflict has been between bourgeois and bohemian. But of course, in the 90s, we were able to fuse them together. And the bourgeois and the bohemian became friends. That's what a Bobo is. A Bobo is someone who pays high prices, but has high prices for whatever it is they buy, and they buy traditional things, but they also live bohemian sex lives and lives of pursuing pleasure and whatnot. A sign of the rise of bohemian or Bobo culture is Starbucks, because Starbucks, the interior decoration of Starbucks is based on the bohemian sex shops of the 19th century, but you pay high prices for your coffee. Yeah, I am. I'm a Bobo. That's my generation, man. No, I'm not a Bobo. But we all compromise in some way, right? So anyway, but from the democratic society comes tyranny. By the way, kingship is not tyranny. Because we live in a democratic society, we think kingship and tyranny are the same thing, because we've accepted the propaganda of the Democrats who rule us. But kingship and tyranny are different. Tyranny is when the soul, basically, the ultimate form of pleasure is power, is what Plato argues. Augustine makes this even more clear. He says the ultimate drive within us is the lust for power. And you'll see that. I mean, the mafia knew this. The mafia knows this very well in New York City. It knows that the way to get guys into the mafia is to start them off on pornography. Right? So the mafiosos will go through the streets and they'll drop little pornography cards on the streets in the hopes that you'll pick them up. The boys will pick them up, and then those cards won't be enough for them. So now they'll go to the internet. But in the bad old days, they would walk into the local convenience stores and they would start buying the dirty magazines, and then that wouldn't be good enough. And then they'd have to go down to 42nd Street to the sex shops, and then that wouldn't be good enough, because then they would really want to start getting into violence. And at that point, the mafia can recruit them. Because how do you enter the mafia? You got to kill somebody. That's the highest form of pleasure, is violence. And all you got to do is talk with police officers who study, or they don't study, police officers who have to deal with violent crimes will show you that in many, 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 the vast majority of cases of violent sexual crimes, it's a guy who, as a young man, started off on pornography, and he just went up the slope to violent sexual crimes. It's like a slippery slope. So tyranny emerges from democratic society. What happens in a democratic soul is that eventually the lust for power takes over. Or in a society, a demagogue enters into the scene. A demagogue knows how to make appeals to the masses, appeals to the rabble, in order to gain power for himself. Once he gains power, he starts to kill those who put him in power, and then he starts to rule society on his own. So a great example of this would be Germany in the 1920s, became a complete democratic society, with communists leading. Communism is an ultimate form of democracy. Out of that democratic society, Hitler could easily manipulate the electoral system so as to emerge as a tyrant. In a tyrannical society, power becomes the standard of behavior. And in a tyrannical soul, power becomes the standard of action. That tyrannical soul seeks for power over all others. All others become an instrument to that tyrannical soul becoming successful or powerful.